Alright, hello Year 12. So I've asked you for your homework to do some Realism AO1 answers. Now, there's been some great answers from the few of you who've handed them in. I've given you lots of feedback. For the next steps, for those who've done it, I've asked you to improve it based on my answers. And if you've yet to have a go and are struggling, I now have some exemplars for you. So I've gone through pretty much all of the questions, apart from the one about metaethics, which hopefully should be simple enough. And I've got some exemplars for you. Now, just to be clear, I've written these based solely on the information from the PowerPoint notes that I have given you. So there's nothing new here. I've not used any wider reading over and above what you have had access to. So I just wanted to talk through them. It's in a Word document in the Files section of Teams already, but I wanted to talk through a few bits and pieces just so I can clarify what I've written, why I've written it, and what shortcomings there still are with my answers. I'm also going to relate it to the mark scheme a bit as well. So if you want to take some notes, absolutely fine. If you just want to read this and not listen to my voice or see my face, absolutely fine as well. But if you turn your attention to the first question, which talks about, it says 3 marker, explain briefly what realism means. So I've written this. Realism is, you know what, I'm going to highlight it. So we all know the score. It's that one. Okay. Realism is a sub-branch of metaethics that is categorized by the assertion that moral statements such as charity is good can and do objectively exist. In other words, moral statements are semantically meaningful and can be shown to be true or false beyond one's own psychological perspective. Now, that's 3 out of 3, clearly. There is no redundancy. You do not even need to use the term semantic and psychological in there. Okay? The fact that the keywords assertion, moral statements, and objectively can and do exist are in there are the absolute keys. Okay, you don't need to go any further than that, but all the key terms, are in there. Please try and steer clear of using things like is a set of teachings about morality in the world. You don't need that stuff. We're studying ethics, so you don't need to explain that everything we study is about ethics. You just need to stick to the specific things, the definitions that I've given you of realism. Okay, next one. Explain how naturalism underpins Bentham's UT. Now, in the specification, it does explicitly say that when we study ethical naturalism, you have to be able to link it to utilitarianism. So it's worth revisiting your notes on that if you would like to. So I'm going to highlight this one as well. There we go. So I'll read through it and then I'll talk through some additional bits. So Bentham's hedonistic utilitarianism is underpinned by the assumption that what is good is that which maximizes physical pleasure. Bentham then goes on to construct an ethical approach that attempts to show that we ought to act in order to maximize pleasure. For this approach to work, the belief that pleasure is good must be able to be shown to be objectively true or false. Naturalism, being a cognitive and realist approach, suggests that moral statements can and do exist and are as naturally verifiable as anything else in the world of natural sciences. In this case, hedonistic UT is underpinned by the naturalist assertion that pleasure, let me just move that over, that pleasure being good can be shown to be objectively true or false. Okay, so this question is about naturalism and Bentham linking together. So there is one sentence dedicated to Bentham and one sentence dedicated to naturalism without a direct mention of each other, but that's it. The rest of the answer brings them together. Don't need a conclusion. It's not an argument, so you don't need an argument map. And just to be clear, don't just talk about Bentham and naturalism. I don't want to know about Bentham's hedonic calculus or, you know, his wider approach to utilitarianism, and I don't want to know about the different types of naturalism. I just want to know about how the basic foundations of naturalism apply to Bentham's utilitarianism. You need to make sure that you are clear on how to use the words objective, assertion, which is in there, and cognitive and realist. And also you can see that in every sentence, all of which are, none of which are, I should say, are redundant, there are key terms: assertion, pleasure, maximization, etc., etc. So have a reread of that. And as I said, you do not need to conclude it, and this is not appropriate for an argument map. 5 out of 5. Okay, this is the one that a lot of you found tricky, which is the open question argument. So I've tried to make this as clear as possible. So if you're thinking I didn't really understand the open question argument, I've tried to make it clear in this 5-mark answer. Okay, so it goes like this. G.E. Moore's open question argument, it doesn't matter who G.E. Moore is, don't get stuck into that, I'm going to carry on. G.E. Moore's open question argument is a critique of the naturalist position within the realist approach to metaethics. Dimmock and Fisher state that the open question argument acts as a searchlight for the naturalistic fallacy. Don't need to know what that is, not the question. The open question argument begins with the premise that some approaches to ethical language try to define good by using another term such as pleasure, without offering a definition of this second concept. In this case, the open question is it true that pleasure is good? This is a meaningful question, but Moore argues that it doesn't make sense to try and answer this just by referring to the words pleasure and good within the question. Something else is needed. Naturalist theories such as UT are false as they are based on these types of open questions but never offer an answer to them. So in order to explain it, I very clearly used utilitarianism as an example to pivot around. There are 2 ways to have done this. The first is to present the open question argument in an argument map. Now, if you really understand the open question argument, that is a better way to do it. However, you can still get 5 out of 5, but you will confuse yourself if you just try and theoretically explain it without an argument map, unless you pivot around an example like utilitarianism. That's pretty much it on that one, I think. Always be clear that it is a critique of a naturalist approach to metaethics. That is exactly what is presented at by G.E. Moore. Okay, first 12 marker of the 2. I'm going to I've written 1 for explain intuitionism and 1 for explain the objections to intuitionism. Note, neither of these are evaluative, so I do not want to know about objections to intuitionism in the first question. I don't want to know whether intuitionism is a good theory or a bad theory. They are completely separate, and all you are doing is stating facts. As such, you don't need a conclusion either, because these are not, you're not arguing anything. It's not an essay. Okay, here we go. You know what? I'm going to highlight it. Just go yellow. Alright, explain intuitionism. Intuitionism is a form of ethical non-naturalism that falls within the realist and cognitive branch of metaethics. In essence, intuitionists argue that moral statements such as charity is good are statements that can and are objectively true or false. But goodness cannot be verified by reference to any natural or scientifically empirically verifiable concept. That would probably get you a 5 out of 5, I guess, and a 5 marker. Every single word there is important. Be clear on how to use objective, empirically verifiable, and using the example charity is good, or using another example which is murder is wrong. That is in essence what intuitionism is. However, it's a 12 marker, and so you need more detail. As a guide, this level of detail is about what you need for a 12 marker. Okay, I've actually mentioned quite a few philosophers here and used quotes, which you don't need to do. But as I said, I'm using just the information that I've given you in the PowerPoint. So what I've done with the answer essentially is gone through the 3 PowerPoint slides on intuitionism that I've given you, and I've ordered them logically into a 12 marker. Okay, which is why I've got more philosophers than you necessarily need. But you can use them, it's fine. Okay, next paragraph. G.E. Moore in Principia Ethica compares the non-naturalistic concept of good to that of yellow. He states that it would be nonsensical to suggest that yellow doesn't exist, but one can't define yellow empirically either. Good is like yellow. It exists and is indefinable. Further, intuitionists such as Richard Price further explain the moral truths are knowable without the process of reasoning. In other words, unlike naturalist theories within realism, intuitionists hold that moral truths, i.e. charity is good, are self-evidently true or false. As W.D. Ross says, they are true or false without any need of proof or evidence beyond itself. This does not mean that moral truths are based on opinions or desires, such as in non-cognitivism. They are objective, but cannot be empirically verified. Any statement, such as murder is wrong, is attempting to show that something is objectively true or false. Some moral statements are true, and some are objectively false. As to how we know or can identify the truth or falsity of these statements depends on the specific approach to intuitionism. In fact, some moral theories, such as W.D. Ross's prima facie duties, give us the a priori moral truths first. Okay, I would suggest that you take a bit of time after this video and go through and highlight any words that you don't know and check the definitions. And again, go back through it and write down any sentences or passages that don't make sense and reread them. Try to simplify them. It's important to get 12 out of 12 in the 12 markers. Brilliant. That is my doorbell. I'll pause that for a moment. The pleasures of distance learning and working from home. Anyway, where was I? Okay. Yes, as I said, you need to have a structure in order to get 12 out of 12 in the 12 marker. In fact, to get 10, 11 or 12, you need a structure in order to get in that bracket. It needs to be logical. So I've separated it into 4 distinct sections, so I planned it before I wrote the answer. Logical order, overall definition, further attempt to clarify it, different philosophers and how they explain it, and how it's put into practice. Boom, 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 boom. No redundancies, lots of technical terms. That's why you absolutely and really need to be clear on how to use this technical terminology. All the ones that we went through at the beginning of the year, keep revisiting them. If we were doing lessons, I'd be setting those as sort of starter activities. Do you know what fallacy means? Empirical, a priori. Go check your knowledge, because you're going to be using it next year as well. So I would say that would get 11 or 12 out of 12. And the last one, explain some objections to intuitionism. Now, in the PowerPoint notes that I've given you, there are only 2 slides, 1 or 2 slides, I think, on this. So bearing in mind that I've just used the information that I have given you, I can't get 12 marks because I haven't given you enough information to get the full marks. And just going through the lessons, you can get a B or a C grade, no problem, as long as you can understand and clearly explain everything that I've taught you. In order to get the A stars or the A's, you need to go further. Use your textbook, wider reading, extra knowledge. That's what's going to get you the higher marks. And I'll explain how this isn't a 12 out of 12 answer at the end. But I'm going to highlight it first, then we'll go through it. And again, this is the sort of length that you need to be looking at. You'll notice here that I've used a completely separate structure. Doesn't matter how you do it. It's logical, and as long as it's logical and planned, you can do bullet points. If you do a big argument map, it needs to be explained and introduced with a 12 marker. But you don't need a conclusion, remember that. Okay, explain some objections to intuitionism. Objections to intuitionism can be separated into two categories, namely direct and specific objections to intuitionism and general objections to realist approaches. So first, specific objections to intuitionism. Moral disagreement. If moral truths are knowable and self-evident, as intuitionists suggest, then why do self-proclaimed intuitionists such as Moore and Ross disagree on what constitutes moral goodness? Who is right, and how can this be determined? And if it can't be determined, then is this whole branch of philosophy completely futile? The next objection or criticism is the verification principle. A.J. Ayer and other members of the Vienna Circle put forward the argument that any statement that cannot be empirically verified is meaningless, and since intuitionists claim that moral truths are true by definition and do not need verification, intuitionism is therefore meaningless. And the third specific objection to intuitionism is non-cognitivism in disguise. Synonyms of intuitionism include instinct or sense. A key argument against this approach is to suggest that knowing that a moral statement is true is not objective, but instead is based on emotion, desire, or some other subjective psychological concept. This explains moral disagreement and the wide array of so-called self-evident moral truths, and is a direct objection to the intuitionist claim that moral truths are objective. And in general against realist theories. All ethical theories based on realism, such as Ross's intuitionist-based prima facie duties, suggest that we ought to behave in a certain way based on an identified moral truth. If it is self-evidently true, for example, that murder is wrong, then, Ross says, we ought not to murder. That is what a normative ethical theory is. But Hume says that if any approach does not attempt to explain the is, ought, jump, then it's based on a fallacy. That is a difficult question to answer, no doubt. I wonder if you can figure out already why that wouldn't get 12 out of 12. The layout's fine. It fits with the mark scheme criteria. There's lots of philosophical terminology throughout. It's logically planned. There's no redundancy. Lots of different objections given, but they're brief. A better approach would be to focus on two and in more detail. I'd suggest moral disagreement and the non-cognitivism in disguise arguments. Both of those are given in more detail in the textbook, and you can get an A or an A star if you use the textbook and something else as well. Okay, but you can't get into the top brackets 10, 11 or 12 really unless you have more detail about two arguments there. So I would say, depending on the examiner, it would be 9 or 10 out of 12. And I'll just finish with some hints and tips on A01 questions. Firstly, how do these compare to your answers or your thoughts? What areas of knowledge or understanding do you need to revisit, if any? Think about the length and detail. Have you been putting this much detail into your answers? Are the technical terms that we have been using throughout the year, like fallacy, objective, empirical, assertion, or premise, clear to you? Can and or do you use them correctly in your answer? If not, go back and familiarise yourself with them. Proofreading is key. There were a couple of grammatical errors in mine, but we won't say anything about that. For now, I'd suggest that all this stuff, learning from home, it should be open book. Don't worry too much about time. This is about showing that you understand the concepts. This is really the only way that I can properly know that you understand what you're learning. And I'll give you loads and loads of feedback on each of your answers if you take the time to have a go at them properly. Think about that. What do you need to know now? Is there anything that you need to go and practice or do or revisit in order to bring your knowledge and understanding up to the level where you could provide these sort of answers? As ever, use Teams, use email, and I'm here if you need me. Thank you for listening.